Hello, my name is Markantonatou Vasiliki and I'm a marine ecologist working on systematic conservation planning. Terrestrial freshwater and marine ecosystems are connected via multiple biophysical and ecological processes. Maintaining these connections among protected areas is often an essential component in conservation. For instance, for species with populations distributed patchily across the landscape that depend on dispersal for maintaining their genetic variability, or for wide-ranging species like big mammals that require more space and their survival depends on their ability to move between protected areas. It is important also when considering sources of threats to biodiversity in one realm that can influence the conservation status of other realms. Finally, the fact that climate change is likely to alter the distribution ranges of many species requires to ensure that the landscape mosaic between habitats remains hospitable for such species in the future. Therefore, thinking beyond the borders of a single realm planning to secure areas most critical for the long-term protection of biodiversity is imperative. Identifying and quantifying links among ecosystems is necessary for the uptake of integrated conservation actions across realms. Such actions are particularly important for species using habitats in more than one realm during their daily or life cycle. However, connections among realms have been broadly ignored when managing ecosystems, and conservation efforts have mainly focused on a single realm. Giacomi et al. 2018 showed that about 30% of European conservation concerned species use habitats in multiple realms. Less than a third of these species are funded for conservation actions across multiple realms. Although certain groups of multi-realm species like beetles are relatively well covered, other groups like mammals and marine fish were amongst the least funded groups. Cross-realm management actions were mainly taken for least concerned multi-realm species. These management actions in place concern mainly multi-realm species in the terrestrial and freshwater realms. While some threatened multi-realm species have only been protected in only one realm that is associated only with one stage of their life cycle. Transportation and service corridors were identified as the most important threats for these species. Interfaces are spatial entities where elements of two or more realms are intermixed and the connecting processes occur. Interfaces can be narrow, where realms have relatively little spatial separation, such as along riverbanks or narrow intertidal zones. Organic matter and organisms move across these interfaces. Otters, for example, move across freshwater and terrestrial realms and their interface. In broad interfaces, there is a wider mixing zone between realms, often forming distinctive interface ecosystems, characterized by internal zonation and gradients formed by physical environment and biological responses. Examples are salt marshes and swamps. For instance, vegetation that relies on periodic flooding and water exchange between wetlands and the main river channels creates large areas on which waterbirds depend on. Ecological connections between sites may not require that sites are adjacent. In a spatial context, they involve two or more habitats in different realms that are linked. Usually, the strength of connections weakens as distance increases between these habitats. There can be constrained connections that occur along natural pathways or anthropogenically created corridors that spatially restrict the movement of organisms or the material, and diffuse connections that vary in space and time and therefore are difficult to delineate. For example, the routes of sea turtles as they move from feeding areas to nesting routes and vice versa create connections between sea and land that are variable and frequently hard to quantify and manage. The strategies to integrate all these types of connectivity can be at the level of habitats that are linked through the movement of organisms, species that move between realms, or internal heterogeneity of interfaces. We may also define a minimum or maximum distance between areas to ensure biological and physical connectivity between realms, or define buffer zones along interfaces or around areas to support multi-realm processes, or align areas to ensure that major movement axes are maintained. We can also have various sizes and shapes of planning units to represent these processes and interactions within and across realms. We can also incorporate in our plans spatial or temporal parameters, for instance related to seasonality. Makino et al. Aim to identify priority conservation areas to protect coral reefs. They compared conservation strategies considering different types of connectivity models into conservation planning by incorporating threats that cause declines in the condition of reefs, such as fishing at the sea and logging and agriculture on land that through the river runoffs increase the sedimentation, nutrients and pollutants in the marine environment. These processes degraded the coral reefs located a few kilometers away from the river mouths. They ran several scenarios considering different types of connectivity. First, all connections were ignored. Then they considered only connections in the marine realm, such as the movement of adult fish and the dispersal of larvae from fish and invertebrates. And this strategy favors the connections between adjacent reef planning units, which is a common approach to design spatially compact conservation areas in one realm. In symmetric land-sea connectivity, connections between catchments and reef planning units were considered to be equally important in both directions. These directions represent movements of anadromous, catadromous and amphidromous animals. In the asymmetric connections, directional connections between catchment and reef planning units represented the propagation of threats from land. For example, if a reef is prioritized, then the closest catchment is more likely to be prioritized as well due to its influence on the reef. On the contrary, if a catchment is selected to be managed appropriately, the selection of a nearby reef may be avoided. They ran Marksan's spatial prioritization tool to identify conservation areas both on land and sea. The outputs of Marksan at the right indicates how many times each planning unit was selected out of the 100 times that Marksan ran in each scenario. The higher the selection frequency of a planning unit, the more important this planning unit is to be included in the reserve network. The authors concluded that only 11 to 40% of priority sites were shared between scenarios with and without connectivity. Many coral reefs that were a high priority in the adjacent connectivity scenario were assigned as low priorities when symmetric land-sea connectivity was included, and vice versa. They also showed that implementation costs of management actions could be significantly lower when considering connectivity. This strategy is useful when the conservation objectives are to avoid negative runoff from the land. Major et al. Used Marksan to select priority conservation areas for the sea turtle Caretta caretta in the Mediterranean. They considered the ecological connectivity between the marine and terrestrial realm, since sea turtles live at the sea but nest on land, and within marine realm, as sea turtles forage, move and reproduce at the sea. They included various types of information to represent important habitats in the sea turtle's life cycle and set specific numerical targets for their protection. Initially, they used a typical approach in planning with a general target for protecting 20% of the overall distribution range of the species. Then they integrated more detailed information, setting explicit targets for the various habitats in the two realms, foraging, nesting and internesting habitats, and moving tracks that were defined with mark and recapture and telemetry methods. By comparing the results of priority areas selected under the effects of different types of information, they showed the importance of integrating ecological connectivity concepts in conservation plans and how this information influences the outputs, particularly when you study high migratory species. Hermoso et al. Studied the ecological connectivity between the freshwater and terrestrial realms. Reserves located in middle or lower watersheds often suffer the cumulative effects of hydrological alternation and pollution originating in both upstream and downstream that threaten biodiversity. For instance, if you want to protect a fish that lives in one part of the river and spawns in another, you should protect both habitats and the part of the corridor that connects them in order to secure the fish's safe movement. The authors introduced the concept of longitudinal connectivity, which represents the interactions along the river networks. This can be the exchange of nutrients between the various realms along the rivers, the propagation of threats from land through the rivers, and the condition of the entire river catchment that influences the river biodiversity downstream as threats propagate. The planning exercise aimed to protect the freshwater fish in the Guadiana River basin that, although it's not overpopulated, agriculture has deeply transformed the landscape, modifying the natural flow regimes and fragmented fish habitats. Planning units were the river's subcatchments for better representing the natural boundaries of influence areas from land-based pollution. A distance-based formula in Marxan was applied that avoided the selection of isolated planning units and therefore avoid the fragmented solutions that partially protect the processes for freshwater fish. Marxan selected connected planning units, meaning closer upstream areas that were located away from upstream perturbations, in order to secure conservation of ecological connectivity in freshwater networks that were not impacted by land-based threats. This approach was later further developed, including, apart from the longitudinal connectivity, the lateral connectivity, for species like waterbirds, for example. Waterbirds' movements are not constrained within river catchments only, but also move in habitats between neighboring lakes or wetlands in a lateral way. When these connectivity rules were applied together, lateral and longitudinal connectivity, they allowed the identification of priority areas that contain whole lakes or wetlands, their closest neighbors whenever this was possible, and the upstream, downstream reaches of rivers that flow into or from them. This integration of the new aspects of ecological connectivity in conservation planning facilitates longitudinal and lateral movements of biota while minimizing the influence of disturbances potentially received from upstream or downstream reaches. Temporal connectivity has also been integrated in conservation planning to represent the temporal changes in water availability in regions with wet and dry seasonal changes such as the Mediterranean. In freshwater ecosystems, organisms' movements through the landscape are facilitated by the presence of water, and eventually they are constrained by the presence of a minimum amount of water. Therefore, spatial connectivity in this sense is strongly influenced by temporal dynamics. Rivers and streams, or floodplain wetlands and lakes, that act as refugia for species are hydrologically connected during the wet season. However, during the dry seasons, they may dry or be reduced to isolated pools. As a result, during these periods, the connections between the different elements of the systems are constrained. In this case, a factor that described the permanence of water in these habitats, the water residency time, was used to reflect the refugial potential and connectivity in freshwater ecosystems. This means that the areas being covered with water during the whole year were weighted more. So they were preferred as priority areas since they were more important for securing the maintenance of species processes and life cycles. On the contrary, areas with interannual variations in water or extended periods of dryness were given less weight, therefore were less preferred by Marxan to be selected as priority areas. The authors concluded that integrating spatial and temporal connectivity requires wider areas in comparison to accounting only the spatial connectivity, and this reveals the importance of accounting for temporal connections when identifying freshwater priority areas in these types of environments, to assess periods of longest spatial connections and maximize the refugial role of freshwater priority areas during dry seasons. So identifying the importance and potential of integrating various concepts of ecological connectivity in conservation planning requires more research and funding that should be placed towards this aspect.